Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Proving Subcontractor Delay Part 2. My name is Tyler Riddell and I'll be moderating today's session. Today's special guest speakers are Bill Haight and Tony Byler. Since we have a great turnout, we'll conduct the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. However, please submit your questions at any time via the chat message on the right side of your screen, and we'll take those at the end of the presentation. If you don't know much about eSub, we were founded back in the early 2000s with one principle: helping commercial construction subcontractors get paid for the work they do. Our easy-to-use mobile cloud project management and document control software helps firms reduce risk and increase profits by connecting the field with the office. And this is why we have partners that provide thought leadership, legal, and consulting services to help our clients succeed in our highly competitive industry. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bill and Tony.
Thanks, Tyler.
You bet.
Thanks, Tyler. As Tyler mentioned, I'm Bill Haight. I'm a director at Troner Consulting Services, and we specialize in construction claims and scheduling consulting work. We work for owners, GCs, and subs, and I do scheduling work and claims work for each level of that. And presenting with me today is Tony Byler.
Tony Byler. I'm a partner at Cohen Seglius. We're a construction boutique located in the Midwest. We have 8 offices serving from New York down to Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia to Louisville, Kentucky. We have over 70 attorneys who focus on construction litigation. And Tyler's blurb for what eSub does is what we claim that we do as well. And that is helping our subcontractors. We represent over 1,200. Get the money that they deserve for doing the work that they perform.
All right, thanks, Tony. So, as we mentioned, as you can tell from the title, today is the second webinar in a series of 3 webinars about proving subcontractor delay. And now, I'm sure some of you attended the previous webinar, but if you have not, that webinar is available to download on eSub's website. The first webinar essentially was looking at proving subcontractor delay when schedules are available to the subcontractor. Today, we're going to be looking more at proving subcontractor delay when you're not getting schedule updates on the project. Now, we're going to go over some things that we touched on in the last webinar, specifically a lot of scheduling and project delay basics, and I'll go through that pretty fast. Because as I mentioned, you can see that on the previous webinar, but it's still important to have a good foundation for what we're talking about on the back end of the webinar if you haven't yet seen the previous webinar. So today's outline, we'll be talking about essential scheduling, critical path, and project delay basics. This will be a review of some information from the previous update or previous webinar. We're also going to talk about why we have to prove delay. That's going to be a bit of a review as well. However, Tony was not in the previous webinar, and he has some really key pieces of information and knowledge that he can impart on us in these sections of the presentation. Then we're going to get into what an as-built schedule is and actually how you can go about building that as-built schedule. Then we'll talk about identifying and quantifying delay. This is the example section. And then in the next webinar, what I'm sure a lot of you are concerned about are the delay-related costs and the compensability aspect of once we've proven these delays, what can we get paid for, and what costs stem from those delays. So that'll be in the third webinar in this series. So our learning objectives today: understand the basics of critical path and project delay, identify why it is necessary to prove delay. And I think this is a really important point that Tony will help drive home on just proving that you have a cost impact is not good enough. Identifying the issues with total cost claims, you'll be able to explain what an as-built schedule is, and you'll be able to demonstrate the amount of delay experienced by a subcontractor when you do not have updated project schedules. And then following that, we'll have a little bit of time for questions, hopefully. And if any questions don't get answered, please submit those questions, and Tony and I will get back to you with an answer to whatever you have that's burning in your brain. Okay, so let's get into a quick review of the scheduling, critical path, and project delay basics. I'm going to go through these couple slides pretty quickly. The first is just essential scheduling basics, and we say that nearly every project has a project schedule. I think sometimes when we talk about scheduling and project schedules, a lot of times people like to think of a sophisticated scheduling software, developing a schedule in Primavera or Microsoft Project, and that's not nearly the case on a lot of projects, right? A lot of projects can simply be a bar chart, something done in Excel. We say here in point 2 that a schedule can be a graphical depiction or a written depiction. You know, we see some schedules that are essentially just a narrative of how the project's going to be built, geared to certain milestones or contract dates.
I saw a major project in the last year done for an international airport where the general contractor did a handwritten bar chart to replicate the schedule and did handwritten updates along the way. So you're absolutely right. It can run the entire gamut.
And, you know, it's important to us because just as a bid is an estimate of your project cost, the schedule is your estimate of your project time. And, you know, we also know that there's significant amount of costs and dollars associated with time, whether that be liquidated damages or that be your general conditions on a project. We really want to know how long a project's going to take, and that initial schedule and the resulting updates are important for us to just kind of know where that project is. So 2 of the major scheduling terms that you'll hear us talk about are the baseline schedule and the schedule updates. Baseline schedule is essentially the approved depiction of the contractor's plan, right? This is how the job's going to be built. This is agreed upon at the beginning of the project. The schedule update is a periodic, we say typically monthly, but we've seen, you know, 2 updates a month, you know, every 2 months updates, but typically it's a monthly update, and that's showing you the progress that's being captured on the job and how the job is progressing. And that's also now forecasting any changes that you've made to the work, any sequencing changes, any added work, and forecasting when that project will be complete. So the schedule update is an important tool as the project goes on to, you know, really know where you're at contemporaneously on the project. Now, some critical path and project delay basics, and I know I said it in the past webinar, but this is one of the key things that if you get anything out of today's presentation, this is one of the things I want you to take home with you. Only delays to the project's critical path can delay the project completion. And, you know, you'll hear a lot of different things about what the definition of a critical path is. We still have a lot of people when they're using construction scheduling software, they'll say that the critical path is the path of zero float. That's not necessarily true with some of the sophisticated scheduling software today. You know, there's calendar effects, there's constraints in those schedules. So we say that the critical path is the longest path of work in the schedule that forecasts when the project will finish. Okay. Now, what's important to note here is not every delay to the critical path will delay the project. Again, this is sort of a function of, without getting too far into the weeds here, a function of calendars and constraints. The longest path is the critical path, and the critical path can and does shift. Okay, so throughout the project, as the project's changing, as activities are making progress or not making progress, you're going to see that critical path shift. So, along with the critical path and project delay, not all delay is created equal. Some activity delay and project delay are not always the same. Some activities can be delayed without actually delaying the project, and that's really a result of float. Okay? And what's float? Float is the difference between when an activity can start and when it must start. So we say the total float is essentially the difference between the late finish of an activity, the late finish being when that activity must finish before it delays the project, and the early finish. When is the earliest that that activity can begin or can finish, right, based off of its predecessor activities. So total float is how much that activity can be delayed without delaying the project. Now, sometimes on projects you'll see negative float. Often on projects you'll see negative float. That's essentially just a constrained milestone, right? So that's holding a certain date within the schedule, and the software just tells it that any activities that go beyond that is going to represent negative float. So Tony's going to talk a little bit more about the importance of float and contractually what float means to you.
Thanks, Bill. So the question often comes up, who owns the float on any given activity? And like nearly anything on a construction project, and ownership of float can be determined by a contract document. Contract documents can theoretically assign ownership of float to the owner. It can assign it to the contractor, and then down the chain the subcontractors, or it can assign it to the project. I will tell you, I review dozens of contracts on an annual basis. I've reviewed and negotiated probably 1,000 in my lifetime. I would think that there's only been about 4 or 5 contracts that I've ever seen that has specifically identified how float is to be allocated and apportioned. And on all of those instances, the float was allocated to the project. And you see in the slide here, the concept of allocating float to the project is, first come, first served. Whether it's the owner, the contractor, subcontractors who get to it first, they're the ones who can use it. Arguably, I have heard of instances where float is assigned to the owner, and what is the consequence there? It means that the owner can consume any float in a particular activity on its own, and the contractor and the subcontractors are therefore bound to perform within the strict constraints of each activity without any additional adjustment. On the flip side, if float were assigned entirely to the contractor would have the right to use the float to administer or adjust its activities as it wanted to, and the owner would have no recourse if the contractor did so long as the contractor adhered to the critical path of the project. So the issue is, what happens if the contract is silent? And I've already told you, most contracts that I've seen and that I'm aware of are silent on this issue. And when the contract is silent, there is no real defined answers. Courts are reluctant to decide that there is a particular entity that owns a float when contracts are silent. The majority view, is we've indicated here, both from decisions that have touched upon it as well as articles and treatises, suggests that the first party to use the float owns it, provided, of course, that it's used in good faith. It would not be a good faith use of float if you're the subcontractor and you expect to be able to use some float, and the general contractor decides at the beginning of each of the activities that it's not going to perform certain work or wants to frustrate the progress of the subcontractors. That would be an inappropriate use of the float. But the majority view is backed up by a couple of other considerations. One is the concurrent delay analysis, and without getting into the specifics, the idea there is that when an owner and a contractor, or an owner and subcontractors, have both impacted the critical path, the contractor or sub is not entitled to additional compensation in terms of dollars, but is entitled to additional time. Using that framework, if the contractor or subcontractors use time that is not on the critical path to perform their projects, no court has found that an owner is entitled to say that it owned the float. So by analogy, the contractor and subcontractors have been deemed to own the float. There is a Board of Contract Appeals decision that implicitly recognized that float is best used by a contractor. In that decision, the court said that float allows the contractor latitude in scheduling non-critical activities that originate or terminate at the events, and to effect trade-offs in resources to shorten or control its project. So it's consistent with that. Also, it's consistent with the concept that a contractor has an incentive, a built-in incentive, to complete the project earlier than the schedule necessarily says it will complete. And what's the incentive? If it gets it done more quickly, it's likely to do it more efficiently. It will expend less potentially on overhead costs and general conditions. So another authority or position to say that the contractor and subcontractor owns the float is tied to the concept that there is an implicit incentive for the subcontractors and contractors to complete quickly. What's the practical consideration? I don't know that float is the most often talked about issue on construction disputes, but if if the issue does come up, the practical consideration, you should always claim the float is yours. I've noted here, especially if you're being called up for delay. You should always say that you're entitled to use the float because it allows you to schedule your activities in a manner that is most efficient to you. And it's tied to the idea that you will achieve, or you should be entitled to achieve, early completion. All right, so the question then turns to how can a project be delayed? And there's no mystery. I'm going to advance here a little bit. There's no mystery that there's a ton of ways that a project can be delayed. We'd spend all afternoon discussing them, but we put up a couple of bullets that highlight some of the most common of the delaying events. When we put up differing site conditions, that doesn't necessarily only adhere to unforeseen or differing site conditions below grade. It can also be you, the sub, going into a project where you're going to do some rehab work. You expect there to be a metal stud or 2x4s behind the wall that you remove, and you find brick, or you find hazmats, asbestos, lead. Any of these are differing site conditions. These can cause a project to be delayed, as well as a change in the character of the work, added and changed work. I'm working on a project right now downtown Philadelphia. It was conceived to be a large high-rise tower and a 5-story structure, and halfway through the project, the owner decided that that 5-story structure should be another high-rise tower. These things could, of course, push out the intended completion of the project. What is important in this context is that you know what your contract or your subcontract says regarding delay. And this could be a separate topic of a seminar. I'm not going to go deeply into it, but keep in mind that the concepts that I have here as notice. Your contract is going to say, in the event that you are delayed, you have to provide notice to your customer up the chain, whether that is another subcontractor, whether it's a general, whether it's a prime, whether it's the owner. That has to be scrupulously adhered to, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on. Also, the contractor is going to talk to you about your entitlement. What happens in the event that you're delayed? What are your recourses, and what are your what are the considerations that you get either in time or dollars? And then, of course, you have to look at your notice provisions in your contract to determine what types of proofs you're required to present to your customer when you are delayed. I've seen everything from you must provide a time impact analysis along with your notice of delay, which, as we all know or should know, can be a very complex, very expensive thing to do, which could drive a small subcontractor out of work if, in fact, it had to adhere to that. These are things that have to be considered at the time of contract. So let's talk a little bit about, and this is a generalization, but this is a helpful flow chart. It's a good starting point. When delay occurs, there are two types of delays in terms of whether you're going to get something or whether you're not going to get something. On the far right are the non-excusable delays. And what do I mean by that? These are delays that are caused exclusively by you, your subs, your suppliers, your laborers, those people for whom you are responsible for. If you are the cause of a delay, the consequence is you get no time, you get no money. And what are the examples? If you're late in submitting, if you're late in obtaining a permit where the obligation to get the permit is yours, late performance, late material deliveries, failure to put labor on the project, these are all issues that can result in this. And not only is there no time and no money at the end of that path, a very bad path to take, there's also exposure in terms of liquidated damages and actual damages on most projects. So let's go to the more friendly side, the left side in this display, which is excusable delays. And what are we talking about there? Well, let's talk about non-compensable, the yellow category first. Non-compensable excusable delays are those that are caused either by delays that are caused by acts of God or by others and you. And what do I mean by that? I talked before about concurrent delay. You'll remember that a concurrent delay is when a project is delayed by both you and someone else on the project, usually the owner. When that happens, the consequence is that you get time, but generally no money. And examples of this are not only concurrent delay, but major weather events, hurricanes, things that neither the owner nor you as the subcontractor can control. And then we go further to the left under compensable excusable delays. And what do we mean there? What I mean there is these are delays that are caused exclusively by others up the chain. And these can be, such examples as work stoppages caused by the exposure of hazardous substances, delays in permitting where the owner is required to obtain the permits, differing site conditions, rephasing. Again, there's a whole number of ways in which the owner or contractors up the chain can cause delays to the project. In concept, these result in both time and money. I again say you have to go to your particular contract because most states and most courts believe that the parties themselves are empowered to decide what you get in the event of delays. So that has to be observed. So as Bill alluded to earlier, the fact that you have a cost overrun on a particular project does not prove that you've been delayed. I will tell you that most clients that I see and consult with on a daily basis will come to me and they'll say, Tony, we're at the end of the project now, we're getting near the end of the project, and we're comparing our cost report costs, the total costs that we've incurred, against the bid amount that we submitted. And the result is we're now 40,000 man hours over, we're $1 million over, we're $50,000 over. And what they've done, whether they know it or not, is they've engaged in what's called a total cost methodology or total cost claim. It is the easiest way to try to approximate a loss on a project caused by delay. It is far from the best. In fact, what we will hear, and what we'll hear from both the courts as well as other people who are writing in journals and industry standards, it should be avoided, and I'll explain why. When you rely upon this type of analysis, you start with the total cost that you've incurred. And the question is, was your total cost that you incurred reasonable? For example, when you employed double time work on the project for several months, was that necessary? Was that caused by you and your company trying to recapture schedule, or was it caused by the owner or a superior general contractor? That's an assumption that is not answered by this type of methodology. Also, there's an assumption that the delays were caused exclusively by others and that you didn't contribute to the delay at all. If we go then to the bid amount, again, this type of analysis assumes that your bid was good, that you had the appropriate values to labor, you had the appropriate values to materials, that you had a complete bid value, that you didn't miss anything. And again, as we all know, and then of course that you had an appropriate profit and overhead value built in. As we all know, it's easy to miss things, and sometimes you make assumptions about projects that don't come true and perhaps should not have come true. So the question then becomes, how do the courts view a total cost claim? And I've already sort of shown my hand. They are not preferred. They're disfavored. And as one court, I think it was the California decision, said, it is tolerated only when no other mode is available. I think that's fairly strong language about how undesirable that is.
And to jump in here too, when from our side, when we're evaluating claims or trying to prepare a claim for a client, sometimes when we get just sort of handed to us, say, hey, this is my bid amount, this is my cost, here's where I'm over, what can you do for me? What that ends up doing is creating a lot more work on our end, which essentially makes the bill for our services a lot more. So as much as possible when you're trying to figure out your claims, if you can get some direction, even if it's just here are the major issues or some sort of analysis, which we've kind of gotten into in the previous webinar and this webinar, to kind of point in the right direction and identify really what the culprits were on the project, that helps narrow everybody else's focus that's going to be handling the claim afterward.
Excellent point, and it dovetails into exactly what I was about to say, but let's finish this up on the total cost. If one is to use the total cost methodology, again, which is problematic, the courts have generally required that 4 conditions be met. One, you have to prove that actual damages, the calculation of actual damages is impracticable. That is tough, but in some instances we could say, the subcontractor didn't have the software, didn't have the resources to be able to identify particular delays and the dollar consequences. So that is problematic, but it's not the most problematic. Getting to the second one is, you have to show that the defendant was solely responsible. And this is even more difficult if you are a subcontractor, and it becomes increasingly difficult if you become if you're a second tier or a third tier subcontractor, because the question becomes, who is the defendant? Who is the party responsible? Is it the subcontractor above you? Is it the general contractor? Is it the owner? Is it some combination thereof? When there is multiple causes, this total cost methodology becomes very ineffective and often will result in the claim being thrown out. Of course, you have to demonstrate that your bid was reasonable and that your actual costs were reasonable, which is something that I alluded to before. So what is a better means rather than the total cost? Well, the better methodology is to look at actual cost methods. There are many, but the concept there is what Bill was alluding to. It would require a subcontractor to keep good records through the processes that it has, whether it's using the mini modules and tools that eSub has available, or whether it's others, in that you periodically and carefully determine what were the delaying events, who caused them, what was the consequence, and tying your costs to those particular events. So let's continue going on proving delay. As we know here, subcontractors are in a unique position in terms of identifying and proving delays, and it has a lot to do with schedules. Now, on a particular project, a schedule can be developed conceivably by the owner or its consultants. The primary schedule, the baselines, are usually done by the prime general or a scheduling consultant. And then as the project evolves, of course, there are schedule updates. The obligation, the contractual obligation, is usually for the general contractor or the construction manager to make schedule updates on a periodic basis. And it is usually, these entities are usually contractually required to coordinate with subcontractors and other main trade contractors to ensure that the contract schedule updates are accurate and complete. Now, what happens if you're not getting the schedule or the schedule updates? That's the issue that we've presented. What I want to make certain that people are thinking about is that you don't wait until you find yourself on a project where you're not getting a schedule or schedule updates. You have to be proactive. The best policy is to be aggressive and to get the baseline minimally at the time that you are performing, that you're considering the bid and putting together a proposal for the project, and that you continue to work with your customer up the chain to get the updates. And how do we do this? I'm going to advance a slide just momentarily. This is a form letter that we've prepared to help our clients get many component pieces of the project documentation and helpful instruments at the very beginning of the project. Feel free to follow this, use the examples as are applicable. But the idea here is that when your company receives a request to bid or an invitation to bid or submit a proposal, and they provide you with oftentimes a number of contract documents as well as a proposed form of subcontract, you should send out this letter in response that says essentially, thanks, we can't wait to get you our proposal. We have a subcontract review checklist, and based on that, you need to help us complete it by providing us with the following items so we can get you a prompt proposal. And the one that you always start off with, if there is a prime contract or a contract up the chain that is incorporated into your subcontract, this may be the one and only time you get a chance to ask for that. ask for that contract. Ask for copies of the specifications and the drawings that are identified. Ask for the baseline project schedule if you haven't been provided with it. And ask for the most recent schedule update. You can ask for all the updates, but at least the most recent schedule update. Why? Because as you're entering into a subcontract, you don't necessarily know how the project that you are bidding has progressed from the get-go. Maybe it hasn't started yet, but oftentimes it has. I often get a client calling me saying, I need you to review this subcontract. It has to be done at the end of the week. We've already started our work and the project is a month into progress. That is not the time to start figuring out, that's not the time to sign the subcontract and sign to a fixed completion time if you don't know whether the project is on schedule or not. And also, this is your one and only time to ask for copies of the payment and performance bonds on projects that involve them. Don't wait for the project to blow up to ask that from your customer, because your customer will not give it to you. All right, I'm going to go back. So, yeah, how do subcontractors get schedules? Well, if you're asking for it out of the box, using the example that I just asked, you'll at least have the baseline and you'll have the most recent schedule update. Again, we suggest that you ask for it in electronic format. You might not always have the software that allow you to review the schedule in that, but you probably have friends to do so. And making a habit of saving that is going to be helpful to you in the event that at some point in time it's alleged that the contractor was not keeping accurate updates, was breaking logic ties, was starting to fudge the schedule. That can be determined most readily by examining the electronic format rather than trying to examine back-to-back PDFs, especially if it's a very complex project. Ask for it in writing. You have to understand you most likely have contractual obligations to contribute and to coordinate with your customer up the chain. If you're not getting the schedules, you're not able to do that. My suggestion, if you get pushback from your customer, is to write a letter. I don't have a form, but I'll tell you the component parts. You should say you're entitled to the schedule and the schedule updates. You should say that you're required to adhere to those schedules and you're required to participate in coordination, that you need to properly and effectively schedule and perform the work, and the schedules are essential to that, that you've made requests, identify when you've requested, say that you haven't got them, say that you are likely to be damaged, and that the failure to receive the schedules are likely to sever any obligations that you might owe for timely completion. Those are the concepts. A letter like that will almost always draw a response, and you will usually get the schedule updates. And continue writing if you are not getting routine updates. Okay, so the question then becomes, does the general contractor have the right to change? Can they change the work? Can the owner change the work that was originally planned by either resequencing, rephasing, changing the timing? The answer is, of course, yes. Their ability to do so is nearly infinite. I have seen contracts before. I've seen subcontractors who have wisened up, and they no longer want to be in a position where they are compelled to do change work, whether under a change order or under a construction change directive, for an indefinite period of time and for an indefinite amount of dollars. I've seen subcontractors in the negotiation phase say that we will not perform additional work that exceeds 25% of our original bid value, things of that nature. But you can be impacted, and you can be impacted a lot. The provisions of your contract to look to give you guidance are going to be those that relate to change work. Sometimes you will see progress or sequencing provisions. You will see remedy provisions and disputes provisions. Again, you can always work with and try to seek remedies for the changes in the project. You should always do so through the change order procedures. And if those aren't approved, if you're not getting the time that you need in dollars, there will be claim procedures that you can avail yourselves of. And then, of course, the subcontractor is in a unique position because it doesn't always have a big picture of what's going on, who the delaying entities are on the project, whether it's the owner, whether it's other tiered subcontractors, either in the direct chain or off chain.
All right, so I know we talked last time about some of the differences between analyzing schedule and delay for GC and subcontractors. So we'll just kind of quickly go through these next two slides, and then we'll get into sort of a actual analysis that we would do for a subcontractor when schedule updates aren't available. So, looking at the project as a whole, when you're doing a schedule analysis for a GC, you're really concerned about what's the end date, what's the substantial completion date, or some sort of milestone within there. And there are more schedule analyses that are available to you. With a subcontractor, you're really only specifically looking at one aspect of the work, right? One trade, and anything that's going to, any other work on the project that's affecting the work of that trade. Some of the analyses can be limited, as well as the ability of that subcontractor to be able to perform the analyses themselves. So you're really not looking at the project as a whole, but much rather the performance of the subcontractor or the trade themselves. So when we do our analysis, we're much more concerned with the plan that the subcontractor had versus what was actually performed by the subcontractor, rather than the overall project delay. I know in the last presentation we showed an example where the project was only delayed 30 days, but the specific subcontractor was delayed something like 90 days. And you can go back and look at that, and the delay to the project wasn't necessarily indicative of the impact that was experienced by the subcontractor. So that's really the difference between the two. And I want to get into sort of the mental process of going through a delay analysis for a subcontractor. And these are the same 5 steps we identified in the last presentation, the last webinar. It's a pretty clear way of thinking about delay. And if you can kind of remember these 5 steps as you're putting together a claim or putting together a request for time, it's going to help you nip any sort of objections to that request. So the first is just identify your planned period of performance. So identify the actual period of performance, compare those two, identify the cause of the delay, and then who's responsible for that delay. So when we identify our planned period of performance, what do we mean? We mean, what did we anticipate? What did we expect to perform to? Where do we get our planned period of performance? Well, this might be as part of your subcontract. As Tony mentioned, when you're preparing your bid, you might be preparing it off of the baseline. Okay, so that's where you're going to get your planned period of performance. You might have a certain date in your subcontract that says when your work must be complete by, right? There you go. There's your planned period of performance. And what's the critical path of this work? Now, often for trades, this is a little bit easier than it is for a general, where there's a lot of different work interacting with themselves. For the most part, for trades, you know what type of work or how your work needs to be implemented to be able to meet that required date in your contract, and that's going to be the critical path of your work.
Just before you advance, Bill, one of the things that we ask our clients about when they come to us and they say that they've been delayed and they've been impacted is we will ask them these questions. How did you plan this project? What was your manpower loading? When did you expect that you would be able to perform the work? In what sequence? And to have them extemporaneously remember these things is often difficult. It's always best to write these things down, memorialize them, put them in a file, lock them away. Because if you are impacted, we're going to come back to you and we're going to ask these questions. And if you have documents that you kept and that you built contemporaneously with your work to bid the project, those are going to be the best evidence and the most persuasive evidence of what your intention was.
So after we've identified our planned period of performance, now we need to understand what our actual period of performance is. Now, last webinar we discussed, hey, this is easy because we had the schedule updates, we had all the scheduled documents for the entire project, we could see the actual dates, we just verify what those actual dates are, that we agree with them, and there's your actual period of performance. In this webinar, it's a little bit more difficult because we do not have those schedule updates. So we have to create what we call an as-built schedule, right? How did we actually construct the job? And we're going to do that using contemporaneous project documentation. Now, after that, we get into what I like to call the what, why, and who, right? The comparison is, well, what was the delay? Okay, how much delay did we experience? And that's simply just a comparison of your as plan versus your as built, and looking at those critical elements of your work and how those critical elements affected or were affected by maybe the owner, other trades, other subcontractors, and how that affected your work and your total period of performance itself. That's the what was the delay. Next is the why, right? Why did we get delayed here? Tony touched on earlier some of those causes of delay, some of the items that might be in your contract that can cause delay, right? Changes to the work, added work, rework. There might be defects to some of the to some aspect of the work or design issues. It might be owner-caused delay. Okay, so there's multiple reasons that delay might happen, but we have to identify. And if you do not identify, it weakens your argument of delay. You have to be able to create a nexus between, the actual days of delay versus what caused it. And then finally is the who, right? Who's responsible for causing this delay? So we talked about an as-planned schedule and where you can get your as-planned schedules. That'd be part of the baseline schedule. What did you bid on? Some dates from your contract. But I want to focus more on the as-built schedule. Okay, what is an as-built schedule? An as-built schedule is simply depicts how the work was done, right? It's often very different from what the plan was. There might be sequencing changes that happened during the project, but your as-built schedule is going to depict actually when an activity started and when the activity finished, right? And to be a true as-built schedule, until the project is over or an interim milestone is complete, you don't have the true as-built schedule. So once all your work is done, you're able to create an as-built schedule. Now, it's a nice task as the project is going on to be keeping up with that as we go, so that it's not such an undertaking at the end of the project. So an as-built schedule shows us a couple things, right? It shows us the day-to-day progress of activities, because we're often using our daily reports or other contemporaneous documents to see what those activities are. It's depicting when things are actually starting and finishing, and we'll use this as-built schedule then to determine any delay on the project and help us in our delay analysis. So once the as-built is established, we can look at that as-built to kind of determine what the critical path of that work was. I mean, we're going to get this from several places. The first is the logical relationships and durations we had in the baseline. We're going to look at that and how those relationships changed. But then we're also going to look at the mandatory construction logic of your work, right? Now, what does this mean? You can't tape until you've got rock up, right? That's just, you can't do MEP activities until you've got the building tight. So there's certain things that are just mandatory construction logic that will help you implement the critical path of your work. So where do we get this information to help us develop our as-built schedule? Well, we get it from a couple different areas. Most importantly, daily reports, right? And this is something that programs like eSub can help you tremendously with, right? It's the ability to document live time, what happened in the field that day, how many, what the manpower was out there, what equipment was out there, what materials got delivered, where exactly you were working. And the more refined your daily reports are, the better your as-built is going to be, and the better you'll be able to identify exactly what caused issues. We'll use meeting minutes often, but they'll give you a little bit better milestone dates or completion dates. Project photos are great too. I know eSub has the ability to do that as well, where you can take pictures of the job and upload them. That gives you an actual depiction of, and a visual depiction, which often is very strong when you're trying to prove an issue, to have visual depictions of it.
Yeah, I can jump in here. If you can't convince your customer or the owner to pay you on a project for the impacts you've incurred, you then have to tell your story to a judge or an arbitrator or perhaps a mediator. And those people have never heard, have not been involved on your project. The ability to show on a daily basis the development of the project, what you are incurring, and match it with photos is essential. It's the story that you have to tell, and that if you get to legal, your counsel is going to look to you to help them convey. So having these resources from the power power of your handheld device or your PM's handheld device is critical and powerful.
So I just want to take a quick peek at some examples of what we're talking about here. Daily reports. Here's an example of a daily report on a project I worked on. What do we know from this single report? Well, I know you might not be able to see that great, but that's, delay was caused by subcontractor due to mobilization. Okay, so it's documented on the daily report here. What work was done? Bypass pump was serviced, and a stop work order was issued on this date. Okay, so that's all really good information that helps us with our as-built and our analysis. Here's an example of a meeting minute, an outtake from meeting minute. What do we get out of this excerpt? There's a possible delay here caused by another project. We've also identified that we expect to mobilize in the second week of December. We've also identified that the hoist location is the owner's responsibility here. So we know from the meeting minutes that the owner has taken responsibility for the hoist location. If we have any delays related to moving that location, we've identified the responsibility of that particular issue. Here are some site photos, okay? The beauty of the site photos is they're really undeniable. Sometimes in meeting minutes or in a daily report, you can have the allegation that whoever prepared it, well, there's a bias there. Well, site photos are what they are, right? The proof is in the pudding there, so to speak. So, you can see, and we have a pile driving activity, and we actually have a date stamp on it. That's the beauty of electronic photos now. They all come with a date stamp that will tell you exactly when that particular activity is being worked on.
Or if you're pushing dailies to an email list that you create, and you're emailing yourself these updates with photos, and sometimes sending it to the other side, especially if you're being delayed, if you're sending it to your customer on a rolling basis, your photos will be the unquestionable project chronology of what took place.
So I want to now get into the example project that we were discussing earlier. And this example project is the construction of 2 new pumping stations. The planned start was January 6th of 2014, and the completion January 1, 2015. So 360-day project. What I'm going to show you is a schedule with a data date of January 6th. Now, that data date just means that's the snapshot. We're looking at it as of the first day of when the project was supposed to begin. So what do we have to do first? We have to develop our as-planned schedule. Okay, we have a couple options on how we can develop it. The best being developing it from the baseline schedule if that's available to us. And in this particular project, the contractor supplied as-planned durations and logic activities for the baseline schedule. So that baseline schedule is a great source for us to identify what our as-planned schedule should be. This might be a little bit hard to see for you, but I'll blow it up in a second. But here's just an as-planned schedule that we pulled off of those durations and those work activities. There's a blow-up of that. And you can see it's just got our flow of work. There's some activities in there that might not be construction activities. So when I get into comparing our as-planned versus our as-built, I'm going to pull out some of those activities that don't necessarily need to be in there and just really focus on the construction activities that my subcontractor was affected by. So here's that same schedule now in Excel. And one of the beauties about doing this sort of analysis is you can do it all in Excel, right? And it doesn't, you can do it with support staff, you can do it with admin staff. It's an easy analysis to do, and it's almost all in Excel. So note right here we have the same schedule, the same sort of activities. I pulled out some of those non-construction activities. Look at the nice flow. That's how the project should look. The work is flowing in a nice sort of diagonal fashion across the chronology there. Okay, and the same sort of blow up of the activity. Okay, so that was our as-planned schedule. We know the next step, once we've established what our plan was, is to look at what did we build. Okay, so the next step is identifying the as-built schedule, and this can often be very tedious and can often take a lot of time. But again, it's something that you can do very easily in-house with simple software programs like Excel, and it can be done by your admin support staff. So that limits putting so much of pressure and time on your PMs and your project engineers.
And
Now, for
Bill, this is Tyler. And a lot of these features that you're highlighting are available in eSub's project management platform. So great stuff.
That's all. And that makes the lives of the subcontractors and you guys and the attendees here using eSub to be able to input a lot of this information, then takes a lot of the burden off of going back after the project is complete and trying to recreate some of these things. So the ability to have the tools that eSub provides makes this sort of endeavor much easier. Now, for this particular as-built, we didn't have eSub, right? So I had to go through over 400 daily reports and identify the progress that happened in each one of those daily reports, okay? Then we supplemented that with meeting minutes, monthly status reports that we received, and project photographs. And sometimes you'll see some work that sort of drags on for an activity, but a meeting minute or monthly status report will give you a firm date that that activity was completed. So that same schedule that I showed you a little bit ago, this is what the as-built looks like for it. And I even had to put 2 Excel charts together there because it stretched out so long. You can see the sporadic nature of the work, but that's one thing that the dailies really help you depict is look at the jump around in the work.
Starts, stops, return to earlier activities,
right?
And extraordinarily lengthened activities.
And you see that workflow is not nearly as pretty as it was in our as-planned schedule. So, we've identified now what our as-built is, and then the next step is, the identification of what the delay was. Okay, so the as-built schedule, we started actually on January 6th with the first date that the project was to begin, but our actual completion wasn't until January 9th, 2017. So an original project that was supposed to take 360 days is now an 1,100 calendar day project. And our data date is January 10th, 2017, so we're looking at it the day after the project has been completed. Okay, so now we do that comparison. What was our planned period of performance? 360 calendar days. What was our actual period of performance? The 1,100 calendar days. Our comparison, we have a 740 calendar day delay. All right, now, but that's not good enough. It's not good enough simply to come in and say, I've got this much delay. Now, on something so egregious like that sure helps. But now we have to identify what the delays were that actually caused that. So our next piece of this analysis is, why did the delays occur? Right? We know that we have 740 days, but why did they occur? So what I've done here is then I've taken those 740 days. You can see to the bottom right corner of this chart, those 740 days are listed, but I've broken them out by all the impacts that affected my work. And I'm just going to focus here on the first 2 impacts, the late permit and the late mobilization. I'll kind of show you how that lays into the schedule. Now, before I move on quick, there'll be a slide at the end of this where this template here, my delay table, as well as my as-built Excel template, will be available if you want to download those. So those will be available on our website for you afterward. Just makes your life a little bit easier rather than having to develop it yourself. So I'm going to focus on these first 2 here, the late permitting and the late mobilization. You'll see that I've identified the permitting was 45 days late and the mobilization was 33 days late. We have a cumulative delay as of March 24th, 2014 of 78 days. Okay? So I'm going to show you where that comes from. So I kind of zoomed in now on our as-built schedule, and our first construction activity, our actual mobilization that we identified from daily reports is a demolition activity. Okay? And it doesn't start until March 24th, 2014. You see I've got that little blue box highlighted for my daily report analysis. So we go through here. The planned mobilization first construction activity was planned to be January 6th, 2014. I didn't actually get out there until March 24th, 2014. That's your delay of 78 calendar days. Now, How do we break up that 78 calendar days into late permitting and mobilization? Well, that's going to be an analysis of the contemporaneous project documents. And one of the things that I recommend to our clients that when we start experiencing issues on jobs, that's a good practice is to create issue folders. As soon as something becomes a problem on a job, as soon as something becomes an issue, you need to tag it and start putting that away. And anything that's related to that issue, file those all together. Now, I know ESUB has the ability to tag or hashtag documents that you're uploading or that you're putting into the program or you're storing in your cloud, that you can actually identify issues on those particular documents by doing that tagging. So what that allows you to do then is go, hey, I was late by 78 days when the project started. What documentation do I have? Well, you know what? I know that permit was late. Now I can get in and say, when did I actually get that permit? I didn't get it till February 19th. Okay, I was supposed to have it by January 6th. There's 45 calendar days of delay.
So that helps in so many different ways. It first helps you real time on the project. If you have a permitting delay and you have now 5 or 6 or 20 different documents to tag to that delay, you attach that to your request for change order, your change order request, and you submit that to the owner and say, these are the reasons that we're seeking an adjustment. And if they say no, then you set that aside, and at the end of the project or later on in the project, you present that as part of your claim. And you've already got, in a nice itemized chronological fashion, the documents that support that delay event.
So who's responsible for those delays? As we just mentioned, I sort of jumped the gun here a little bit, but the late issuance of the permit, the municipality failed to provide the contractor with the required building permit to begin its work. Permit was supplied on February 19th, 45 calendar days late. That's an owner delay issue here. The late mobilization should have mobilized the date that the permit was provided on February 19th, or actually the next day, February 20th. Mobilization didn't occur until March 24th, so there's a 33 calendar delay that might be attributed to the subcontractor. So that's the same sort of analysis, and you would continue that analysis throughout the remainder of that delay table identified. So it is, you can say it's a tedious process, but the better you are at identifying those delay issues throughout the project, the easier this aspect of it is. I know we're getting close on time. We're going to run a little bit over, so hopefully nobody has any tight deadlines. But if you have to leave, again, this webinar will be available on ESUB. But we'll just be just a few minutes longer here.
Yep. So let's talk about notice. I've hinted to it before, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here. But as we've indicated, notice under your contract is often required. If it's not required, provide notice anyway. The courts have looked at these issues and have always usually zoomed in. If it's a public entity that you're working for and there are contractual notice requirements, you have to adhere to them scrupulously, or you can find that you, even though you were impacted, you have no claim. In private projects, the courts often look to whether the delay in any notice that you gave caused prejudice. I'll give you a quick example. If you were the contractor who is paving a road, and you had timely told the general that you've encountered boulders below grade in one particular area where the road was to be put in, and you don't tell the contractor, and you remove the boulders, and then you bring a claim for delays and associated costs, the contractor could easily say, or the owner, that they were prejudiced because if you had told them before you did the work, they could have asked you to redirect the road, possibly in areas where there weren't boulders located at a significant savings. So keep that in mind. Always provide notice. When you're looking at your contract, look to the provisions called delay, look to changes, look to headings called notice to tell you what you need to provide. If it asks you to provide specific notice in a specific way, do it. I have partners of mine who are a little bit more cavalier on this issue and say, so long as you're providing emails, that should be good enough. I believe that if you're providing email notice, that's fantastic. But if it says send a letter, send it to Bob, the contact on the subcontract for your customer, and send it by overnight mail with written confirmation, do it. It eliminates easy arguments that shouldn't cloud your claim. Adhere always to your contract to the extent that you can. do send notice. You should always look to your contract to see what is requested, but it's always good to have a form letter that you can follow. We've provided you with a form letter. This is a letter that was developed by my firm and one of our clients on a particular project. It's fairly easy and straightforward. It says, hey, in writing, we're being impacted. Our work is being delayed. We don't want to become adversarial, but we do recognize the need to adhere to the provisions of the contract that we've signed with you to provide notice. As a result, we're telling you about the conditions that are impacting us. And what conditions do you identify? Look, the more specificity, the greater it's going to be. The more utility it's going to be for you. We've left it blank here, but to the extent that you can identify activities that are impacted, that's helpful. Locations on the project where the impact is happening, that's critical. How you were delayed is important. By whom is important. For how long is critical. All right, and then this letter ends that we'll provide you with a summary of the consequences at a later date. Let us know if you have any questions, et cetera.
One thing I'll add here too with notice is we often hear from subcontractors that say, hey, like I was impacted, but I didn't want to write anything. I didn't want to put anything in writing, or I didn't want to upset the general, or we had a good relationship on the project. I just didn't want to rock the boat. And what I'd say to that is often we hear from general contractors who say they actually respect the subcontractor that, has their T's crossed and I's dotted, and is tracking that sort of thing because it helps them keep the project on task.
Yep, I've actually modified this letter on instances that deserve it. I've indicated, especially where there is a ongoing relationship between the subcontractor and the prime, that like on other projects, we've given you heads up. This is the same. We want to help you to avoid additional costs. We want this project to stay on track. We're doing everything we possibly can to help you identify and allocate the cause of the problem and ameliorate them. You can get as helpful and as flowery as you want to, but to have at least a backbone communication that is not adversarial and seeks to avoid that is critical. I'm going to skip ahead one slide, and I'm going to come back to the use of contemporaneous documents. This again, I'm sorry, it is small, but this is an example of what one of our subcontractors did on a project where there were multiple areas of impact at multiple periods of time, and they were continuing. In this particular case, this contractor, our subcontractor, not only sent notice on what I would have thought is a good basis, a weekly basis. This was sent on a daily basis. And as you can see here, he did exactly what I was suggesting that you consider putting in your letter, and that is identifying what are the activities that you are trying to perform. You can tie it out to a schedule activity, you can tie it out to a schedule of values, whatever it is most helpful. Telling the contractor, hey, in this location, in particular buildings, we're being held up. The current status is delayed, and it's because there's asbestos that's preventing us from getting access to these buildings. And this was sent on a routine basis and would be updated regularly. This is profoundly helpful in not only persuading your customer what's going on, but giving them the tools that they need to pass up to the owner to get you paid. Because as we all know, there's often pay if paid provisions in your contract and other conditions that say that your customer doesn't have to pay you until and unless they get paid. So the better that you can enable your customer up the chain to convince the owner to pay, the better. All right, and then just stepping back again, the use of contemporary documents, as I mentioned, is essential. The emails saying that you were delayed on a particular date, attaching photographs, are much more credible and will help you resolve the issue easier without need of legal assistance and consultant's assistance if you do it on a rolling basis. Your customer is going to know what happened, is going to want to see that you're compensated, or will know that there is going to be a significant consequence to denying your request and your claim. By sending routine and updated letters, the story is not going to change. Anybody like an arbitrator or a judge who's looking at it will know what took place and will believe it much more so than if you have your PM sit up and try to project what actually took place on the project going from memory alone. With that, I think we go to a recap.
And I'll just kind of go through this really quick. I mean, I know, as I mentioned before, you can watch this presentation on eStub. You'll be able to download it. and watch it later, so you can kind of go through this again, refresh your memory. And our steps are to identify the planned period of performance, identify the actual period of performance, do that comparison, and the important part is to identify what the cause of those delays were, and then who's responsible for that.
And by the way, before you go up, if your turn, one of the things that I think is important for everybody here who's still on to understand is this. If you do these steps on your own, it is likely that you will be in a position to resolve these disputes real time on your own, and if not on your own at the end of the project. The failure to do these things will result in professionals having to do these steps for you, which is more expensive. Sometimes you have no choice and you have to drop back to the professionals. But this is an easy blueprint, if you will, or an outline of what you can and should be doing.
And then 3 quick takeaways to remember. I know Tony touched on it earlier, the responsibility to get the schedules, right? You asked that up front. Tony gave you that letter on what you're going to be asking for, and then repeatedly as the project goes on. Remember, the analysis is pretty simple. It can be done in Excel, and it can be done with support staff. So while it is tedious, don't let that scare you. It can be done just by digging through your project documentation, and then with that, document. I mean, we can't stress enough how project documentation, contemporaneous documentation, utilizing things like eSub and the capabilities of eSub to track the project and have that really established contemporaneous record of what happened on the project, just how important that is. And then lastly, as I mentioned, you can go to the site up top. You'll see there, traunerconsulting.com/eSub. You'll be able to download those as-built delay templates that I discussed about with you, and that's traunerconsulting.com/eSub. Here's the contact information for Tony and I. I know I speak for Tony as well. Feel free to reach out if you have a question on anything. You can give us a call or shoot us an email. And I'd like to thank Tony for his participation here today. Thank you, Tyler, and to eSub for setting this up. And if anybody has any questions, we're free to take them now. Tyler, I don't know if you're still going to take questions now, or it's up to you.
Great presentation, you guys, and thank you so much for being on today. We do have one question. So it's from Andre. What if we have a number of 700 change orders on a period of 4 years? Pretty big project. Do we have to document every single one of them with pictures and reports?
Do you want to talk about it, or I can talk about it?
Yeah, you can jump in, and I'll piggyback.
Sure. Look, these things happen, especially if the project is under-designed or if there's just a number of issues that are going to happen. That's a lot of change orders. Should you? Yes, you should document each one of the changes. Look, when you're asking for a change order, you're asking your customer agree with you that there actually has been a change and that you are entitled to a combination of dollars and time. The best way to demonstrate that is going to be with emails, contemporaneous emails, photographs, etc. So I think it's critical. If you haven't done that, then your likelihood of getting the changes that you want become a little bit more difficult. And if you don't get the changes, then you find yourself in a case of claiming. Your claim is going to have to be proven. So if your customer is saying no, you're not entitled to it, you're going to be looking for the same sort of information in terms of contemporaneous documents and photographs that you would want to attach to your change request in the first instance.
Yeah, when I first heard the question asked, I assumed that they were executed change orders, but Tony makes a great point that, they're change orders perhaps for you, but might not have been executed yet or might not be agreed upon by the owner. So you have to keep that documentation. Now, one thing I'll add to this is the first thing that jumped into my head was, you got change orders for the work and for the actual cost of the work, but you might not have gotten time. And we often see this happen on projects where there'll be a change order, and essentially just to keep the project going and fund it, they'll issue a cost amount for it, but to sort of kick the can down the road for the time related to that. What we typically recommend is that you get time and money together as much as possible, right? Because once you get to the point where the project is concluded, or you're trying to, you said it's a 4-year project, there's 700 change orders. You're trying to remember year 1, change order 37, what the heck happened? And it gets much more difficult then to actually identify what the cause of the issue was that late in the project. So if you can, document as much as possible. That keeps your memory fresher. It's a reminder for you. But I'd also recommend that if and when possible, you get time and money together.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that point, our clients frequently overlook the importance of getting time in every change order, or at least requesting it. You're going to get one bite at the apple. Most change order forms will say that once there's going to be added language, or it's going to appear as a form language, that this compensation is complete, and that you're foregoing any other types of claims or remedies other than identified in the change order itself. So if you don't request time, you're going to be put in a position where a very good argument is going to be made that you have waived it or released your rights. Now, what is that on this particular project? 700 changes over 4 years. At some point in time in that 4-year period of time, this entity knew that there were going to be more, that there was going to be more impacts. And it becomes essential at that point in time, I think, to communicate with your legal professionals, because there's a couple of things that are going to happen. You want to avoid waiving and releasing your rights to what is called cumulative delay or cumulative impacts. And the idea there is, while you may at the beginning of these impacts have captured the time and the dollars that you intended to get to perform that work, over a period of time, if the scope and scale of those changes becomes disproportionate to your original planned scope, then what's going to happen is you're going to erode. You're going to become less efficient with the time that you have. And you're not going to be able to capture all the time. You're not going to be able to capture all of the dollars. So there's an importance to start to identify that for your customer, to start carving out from your change orders that this compensation does not include cumulative delay or other delays that may be later obtained or later calculated. And you should be working with a competent lawyer that you're familiar with and have confidence in, because they will lead you through a series of communications with your customer to preserve your rights, even if the customer ultimately says you have to remove those types of caveats and carve-outs from your change order language.
Great, guys. Well, thanks again. We're running out of time, so I'll have to stop the presentation. And there is one other question, but I'll forward it to the speakers, and it'll be addressed as soon as possible. Thanks a lot, and have a great day, guys.